Have you ever looked into the eyes of a teenage girl, really looked, and wondered what story lives behind them? Behind the laughter, behind the selfies, behind the confidence she tries so hard to project. There's often a quiet, unspoken ache. The world sees youth as a time of freedom, but for many girls, it's the most suffocating chapter of their lives. We talk about growing up as if it's simple, as if it's a process of becoming. But what if growing up feels more like unraveling before you ever get the chance to be whole? Why does society expect her to bloom when the soil beneath her is full of judgment, comparison, and pressure? Why does she have to smile while silently competing with standards no one can truly meet? And perhaps the hardest question of all, when did innocence become performance? The teenage years are often painted as a blur of rebellion and hormones, but if we listen closely, they are years of profound psychological transformation, a storm of identity forming inside a fragile mind still learning how to make sense of the world. At this age, emotions aren't just feelings. They're architecture, shaping who she becomes. Every experience, every glance of approval or rejection, lays a brick in the foundation of her adult self. And yet, we rarely stop to understand the structure being built. Let's ask ourselves, what does it mean to grow up under constant observation? From peers, from social media, from parents, from an invisible audience that never sleeps. How does a young girl learn to love herself when the mirror reflects 1,000 versions of what she should be? Psychologists call it social comparison theory, the human tendency to evaluate ourselves against others. But in adolescence, this comparison becomes a constant whisper in the mind. Am I enough? Do they like me? Am I beautiful? And when the answer feels like no, the heart absorbs the rejection as truth. Many girls begin to divide themselves, the self they are and the self they show. The true self, private and soft, slowly hides behind the social self, polished and practiced. This split isn't vanity, it's survival. Because in a world where validation equals existence, disappearing feels safer than being misunderstood. But there's a cost. Each time she edits herself to fit in, she loses a piece of her authentic identity. Each time she smiles through pain, she teaches herself that silence is safer than honesty. So, what happens when silence becomes her native language? Depression, anxiety, isolation. These are not random afflictions. They are often the symptoms of chronic disconnection. Disconnection from self, from belonging, from being truly seen. Studies in adolescent psychology show that girls experience higher levels of rumination, the tendency to replay mistakes and negative emotions, which amplifies sadness and self-doubt. When she lies awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind isn't resting. It's rehearsing the words she shouldn't have said, the friends who stopped calling, the way someone laughed when she spoke. It's not just overthinking. It's the mind's attempt to rewrite reality, to find control in a world that constantly tells her she has none. And what about society? The very system that teaches girls to be kind, graceful, and accommodating often forgets to teach them strength, independence, and self-worth. We raise them to please before we ever teach them to protect their peace. We praise their politeness more than their honesty. And then we wonder why so many lose their voices before they ever learn how powerful their truth can be. Why do we silence young women and punish them for being quiet? Why do we tell them to be themselves while handing them a checklist of what herself should look like? We like to think of teenagers as resilient, and they are, but resilience isn't the absence of pain. It's endurance in the face of it, and endurance without empathy turns into exhaustion. That's the quiet tragedy of modern adolescence. So many girls are praised for being strong while silently crumbling under the weight of expectations they never agreed to carry. But there's another side to this story, the side we rarely see. In the middle of confusion and chaos, there's also growth. In the struggle for identity, there's discovery. In the loneliness, there's reflection. And eventually, resilience. These are not broken girls. These are becoming women. They are sculpted by rejection, refined by pain, and awakened by realization. So what is the burden of being really about? It's not just about sadness or struggle. It's about understanding the psychology behind those moments. the invisible forces that shape a young mind trying to find her place in a complex world. We take you through the emotional landscape of these young women, not as spectators, but as witnesses. You'll hear their silence, their laughter, their doubt, their strength, all unfolding like it's ours. Because to understand their pain is to remember our own. To listen to their confusion is to reconnect with the questions we've all once asked. Who am I? Where do I belong? Why do I feel so much? And in listening, truly listening, we begin to heal something collective. Because every generation that understands itself more deeply breaks one chain of the generation before. So as we begin this journey, let us not just hear their stories. Let us feel them. Let us walk beside them through each emotional corridor of adolescence, where identity, approval, love, and loss all merge into one complex heartbeat. This is not just a documentary, it's an invitation to empathy, a reminder that the pain of growing up is not weakness, it's the price of awakening. This is the burden of being, a story of what it means to feel everything, and to still try to become something more. And now, we step deeper, beyond the surface, into the spaces where behavior begins to form, where the mind learns its first lessons about approval, belonging, and fear. This is where identity starts to bend, where the teenage years stop being a chapter in childhood and become a mirror for the rest of one's life. Because what she learns here, in this season of fragile becoming, she will carry forever. Have you ever noticed how early it starts? That quiet need to fit in. It isn't loud. It isn't always obvious, but it's there. The subtle rearranging of self that happens in social rooms, classrooms, friend circles, and digital spaces. Watch closely. It's in how she laughs when others laugh, how she says she's fine when she's not, how she agrees when her heart quietly protests. That right there is the beginning of conformity, the quiet death of authenticity, done not out of weakness, but out of instinct for survival. You see, the human brain, especially the adolescent one, is wired for belonging. Psychologists call it social identity theory, the need to derive a sense of self from the groups we're part of. And for teenage girls, that belonging isn't just emotional. To belong is to be safe, to be accepted is to be real. So when the group laughs at someone, she laughs too, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. When they praise beauty that doesn't look like hers, she wonders if she should change. When they take risks that make her uncomfortable, she weighs the risk of saying no against the risk of being alone. Ask yourself, how much of who we become is actually who we are? And how much is the echo of what we thought others wanted us to be? That question, that constant negotiation between authenticity and approval, is the heartbeat of adolescence. Because here's the truth, most adults forget. Teenagers aren't searching for rebellion. They're searching for acceptance. Every act of defiance often hides a plea underneath. See me. Understand me. Let me belong without changing who I am. But the world doesn't make that easy. When you live in a society that rewards conformity more than courage, authenticity becomes a quiet act of resistance. Think about it. From the moment she steps into social spaces, she's being watched, graded, not just on performance, but on personality, fashion, tone, body language, likes, follows, and filtered photos. Everything becomes a silent audition for acceptance. And over time, she learns something dangerous. If I want to belong, I have to adjust my opinions, adjust my emotions, adjust the way I exist. That's not insecurity, that's adaptation. The psyche is trying to protect her, teaching her to minimize rejection by minimizing herself. But every adaptation leaves a scar, because the moment she silences her truth to fit in, a small fracture opens inside her. The fracture doesn't scream, it whispers. It whispers late at night when she replays the day in her head, when she wonders why she felt invisible in a crowd that knew her name. That's cognitive dissonance, the tension between the self she shows and the self she hides. And the longer she lives in that space, the harder it becomes to remember which version is real. Let's ask a harder question. What happens when belonging demands self-betrayal? That's when identity starts to splinter. She tells herself, It's just easier to go along. But every time she goes along, she loses another piece of her authentic voice. And after a while, even silence feels safer than honesty. That silence, the kind that lives behind smiles and "I'm fine," is one of the loudest cries for understanding you'll ever miss. Because she's not quiet by choice. She's quiet because the world taught her that being different makes noise, and noise gets punished. It's easy to say, just be yourself. But what does that mean to someone who's still figuring out who that self is? Selfhood isn't born. It's built, slowly, through mirrors and feedback. And in adolescence, those mirrors are everywhere. Friends, parents, teachers, screens. Each one reflects a different version of her. Each one tells her who she should be, and none of them match how she actually feels inside. That conflict, the tug between internal truth and external approval, is the very essence of the pressure to conform. There's a paradox here. The same instinct that makes her crave connection is the one that teaches her to hide her individuality. She wants to be known, but fears being seen. She wants to be accepted, but fears being judged. She wants to be herself, but doesn't yet know if herself is enough. That's the invisible tension that lives in so many teenage girls. The quiet push and pull between authenticity and acceptance. Imagine this through the lens of psychology. The adolescent brain is still forming its prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for reasoning and decision-making. At the same time, the amygdala, which processes emotions, is in overdrive. That means emotions are louder than logic, and belonging feels like survival. Rejection, on the other hand, doesn't just hurt emotionally. It registers in the brain the same way as physical pain. So when she's excluded, teased, ignored, or misunderstood, it doesn't just sting. It burns into memory. It rewires how she sees herself. She starts to question, am I too much, or am I not enough? And those questions, those tiny self-doubts, begin to shape her future behavior long after the moment has passed. But here's the thing, no one tells her. Conformity might get her accepted, but it won't make her seen. Acceptance gained by imitation is fragile. It only lasts as long as the performance does. And when she's alone without the crowd, that's when the loneliness creeps in. The loneliness of realizing that even in acceptance, she was never truly known. Now, pause, breathe. Because this realization, this quiet awareness, is also the beginning of awakening. Every teenager at some point will stand at this invisible crossroads to keep performing or to begin remembering who they are. And while most adults rush to give advice, few remember how heavy that moment feels when you're inside it. Because to be authentic is to risk rejection, and to a young heart still defining its worth, rejection can feel like erasure. But something beautiful happens in the few who choose to walk away from conformity. They begin to feel discomfort. Yes, but also clarity. They realize that peace is quieter than popularity. That solitude, while scary, is sometimes safer than pretending, and that the ones who truly matter will meet them where they are, not where they perform. That is the first real step toward identity. It doesn't begin with knowing who you are. It begins with deciding who you're no longer willing to be. The pressure to conform isn't just a teenage struggle. It's a human one. It follows us into adulthood, into boardrooms, marriages, friendships. The difference is, by then, the mask has become comfortable. But if we can understand where it began, if we can look back at those fragile years where she learned to trade truth for approval, then maybe we can begin to unlearn it too. Because beneath every habit of conformity lies a child who once feared being left out. And beneath every adult who struggles with authenticity is a teenager who was once told, be quiet, be normal, be like the rest. So as we move forward in this journey, we won't judge these young hearts for conforming. We'll understand why they do. We'll listen, not to the words they say, but to the pauses between them. Because in those pauses, in that silence, we'll find the truth they've been too afraid to speak. This is where the story truly begins, where behavior meets psychology, where pressure shapes identity, and where understanding might just plant the first seed of change. And so we continue. Beyond the struggle to belong, there lies another, quieter, heavier. A pressure that doesn't come from peers, but from the very hands that raised her. The weight of expectation, it begins innocently enough, in words spoken out of love, in glances meant to motivate, in comparisons meant to inspire. But somewhere along the way, love becomes measurement, affection becomes approval, and approval becomes conditional. How early does she learn it? That her worth is something to earn, that her value is a currency traded for grades, achievements, or behavior. You can see it in the small moments, the tense dinner table, the sigh, when a report card is placed on the counter, the way silence fills the room when she doesn't meet the mark. That silence says, everything. You disappointed us. And for a teenage girl who equates approval with love, disappointment doesn't just sting, it devastates. Psychologists call it conditional regard, the experience of receiving love and validation only when we perform a certain way. And for developing minds, it can alter everything. How she sees herself, how she approaches success, how she experiences failure. Because now, love has a price, and that price is perfection. So she learns to work harder, to push herself, to wear her achievements like armor. But no armor is light, and this one gets heavier with every expectation placed upon her. At first, it feels like pride. Parents posting photos of her accomplishments, teachers praising her discipline, but soon it turns into pressure. Because once you've been called exceptional, the fear of being ordinary becomes unbearable. Why do we do this to our daughters? Why do we confuse potential with obligation? Why do we take bright minds and burden them with proving their worth again and again, until achievement feels like survival? The teenage brain is still forming its map of self-worth. Every success, every failure, becomes a data point. And when those data points are tied to approval, failure doesn't just mean, I made a mistake. It starts to mean I am the mistake. That's the quiet psychological wound hidden in so many young women. A perfectionism that isn't driven by ambition, but by fear. Fear of letting someone down. Fear of not being enough. Fear of love being withdrawn. And fear, when disguised as motivation, looks like excellence until it doesn't. Have you ever seen what burnout looks like on a teenage face? It's not the same as an adult's exhaustion. It's quieter. It's the smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, the humor that hides behind, I'm just tired. The late night scrolling, not for entertainment, but for distraction from the voice in her head that says, you should be doing more. This is where self-determination theory comes in. The idea that human beings thrive when three needs are met: autonomy, competence, and connection. But when expectations tighten their grip, autonomy disappears. She's no longer making choices for herself. Competence becomes obsession. She must prove she's capable. And connection turns conditional. She's only loved when she achieves. This imbalance fractures the foundation of motivation itself. What began as love becomes pressure. What began as encouragement becomes control. The tragedy is everyone thinks they're helping her. Her parents want the best for her. Her teachers want to guide her. Her peers want to see her succeed. But no one asks her what she wants. And somewhere between doing well and feeling well, she loses sight of which matters more. The modern world calls it success. But what is success when it costs you your peace? What good is achievement when the heart behind it feels empty? She's told, work hard now so you can rest later. But what if later never comes? What if she spends her life chasing a moving finish line, never realizing the race was never hers to begin with? Every teenage girl who's ever stared at a screen filled with grades, everyone who's heard, you could have done better, everyone who's cried quietly, so no one sees the cracks. They all know this feeling, the feeling of being stretched between expectation and exhaustion, the feeling of running on approval and fear. And maybe, deep down, the hardest part isn't the pressure itself, it's realizing how invisible it makes her. Because when everyone only sees her potential, no one sees her pain. Let's pause. Ask yourself, when was the last time we praised a teenage girl for resting? When was the last time we told her she's enough without performing? When was the last time she believed it? In therapy sessions, psychologists often talk about the inner child, the younger version of ourselves who still seeks the love we never fully received. For many adolescent girls, the child isn't just a memory. She's still right there, trying to meet everyone's expectations while quietly wondering, when do I get to be me? But here's the beauty hidden beneath all that pressure. When she begins to see that her worth isn't tied to performance, something powerful starts to shift. She realizes that failure doesn't define her. It teaches her that love given freely heals more than perfection ever could. That peace is not earned, and that the people who truly matter will never require her to prove her value. They'll simply remind her of it. Because the truth is, expectations don't just shape teenagers, they shape generations. When we teach girls that love equals performance, we raise women who confuse burnout for purpose. But when we teach them that love equals acceptance, we raise women who move through the world with grace, balance, and authenticity on our shoulders. Breathe. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be whole. Perfection demands proof. Wholeness simply asks for honesty. And honesty, though difficult, is what finally sets her free. This is the second layer of the burden, not the pressure to be everything. And in trying to be everything, she forgets that being herself was always enough. The story continues, because after every expectation comes something else: the academic, social, and personal demands that test how much one soul can carry before it begins to fracture. That is where we go next: academic pressures. And so, the expectations evolve. They don't disappear, they multiply. They find new forms: test scores, deadlines, report cards, futures. The classroom becomes a stage. Every exam, an audition. Every grade, a verdict. And for many young girls, this is where self-worth quietly attaches itself to performance. Have you ever noticed how a teenager studies, not just to learn, but to avoid failure? The pen doesn't glide, it trembles. The eyes don't scan the page for curiosity, but for survival. Because the modern education system doesn't simply ask, "What do you know?" It whispers something more dangerous: "Are you enough?" Psychologists have a word for this: performance-based identity. When your sense of self becomes entangled with your results, when the report card becomes a mirror, when success equals worth and failure equals shame. And for so many young women, the reflection becomes painful to look at. We often forget that the adolescent brain is still developing its relationship with pressure. The prefrontal cortex, the center for logic, time management, emotional regulation, is still under construction. And yet, we design an entire culture of achievement that demands perfection from a mind that's still learning how to handle disappointment. Late nights at the desk, coffee replacing sleep, eyes burning from blue light screens. The world applauds her work ethic, but no one notices the quiet panic behind the diligence. We call it discipline. But what if it's actually fear of collapse? Fear of letting down her parents, fear of not matching the success of her peers, fear of being labeled average. The word that feels like failure in a world obsessed with exceptional. Every generation says it: school was hard. But this generation lives in a different kind of storm. There's no longer a clear finish line. Information never ends. Comparison never sleeps. Social media amplifies every success of others and every flaw of oneself. She scrolls and sees classmates getting accepted into universities, internships, scholarships, and quietly, her chest tightens. Not out of jealousy, but out of panic. Because if everyone is moving ahead, staying still feels like falling behind. That is chronic academic anxiety, a growing epidemic masked as ambition. She says, "I just want to do well." But beneath that sentence lives another: "I don't know who I am if I don't." This is where burnout is born, not in adulthood, in adolescence. It begins the first time she learns that rest is guilt, that slowing down is weakness, that the world doesn't reward balance. It rewards exhaustion. And when exhaustion becomes normal, the nervous system starts to adapt. Her body stays in a state of quiet alertness, heart rate slightly elevated, breathing shallow, thoughts racing. It feels like motivation, but it's actually survival. Research in neuropsychology tells us this. Long-term stress changes the architecture of the adolescent brain. Cortisol, the stress hormone, begins to reshape emotional circuits. Memory suffers, attention fractures, sleep becomes irregular, and yet she pushes harder because the system she's in doesn't reward wellness. It rewards endurance. Let's ask a question. When did education stop being about understanding and start being about proving? When did learning become a competition? When did the joy of discovery become a transaction for approval? In therapy sessions, so many young women say the same sentence. I feel like I'm always behind. Behind what? Behind who? There is no clear answer, only the constant hum of inadequacy. That's imposter syndrome in its earliest form. The belief that no matter how hard she works, she's still not deserving of success. And it begins here, in classrooms that reward perfection and punish vulnerability. But there's another side to it. Beneath the fatigue and the pressure, there's also something extraordinary. Resilience. Because every girl who stayed up studying despite doubt, everyone who's faced a failure and got up again, everyone who's cried quietly then shown up to class the next morning, they all reveal a truth about the human spirit, that it can bend, but not always break. Still, bending for too long without healing leads to fracture, and so many fractures remain invisible. The smile she gives to her teacher hides panic attacks. The perfect essay hides sleepless nights. The quiet student in the back hides the belief that she's already fallen behind. But maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't her resilience. It's the system that demands it so constantly. Because how much strength should we expect from someone who's never allowed to rest? Here's a truth we often overlook. Perfectionism doesn't make stronger students. It makes anxious adults. We raise them to achieve, but forget to teach them how to cope. We fill their schedules but empty their joy. We train their minds but neglect their hearts. And then, years later, we wonder why so many young adults feel lost. We call it burnout, but what it really is the aftermath of survival. So how do we fix it? It starts with empathy. It starts with telling them that their value isn't conditional on success. It starts by giving them permission to fail, to pause, to feel, to breathe. Because when we stop equating achievement with identity, we allow growth to become what it was always meant to be. Human. This isn't a story about failure. It's a story about the quiet war between expectation and peace. And every girl fighting it is not weak. She's just carrying too much. The truth is, she doesn't need to be told to work harder. She needs to be told she's already enough. And so we move forward again, from the pressure of society to the weight of expectation, and now to the private, invisible strain of trying to measure up in a world that defines worth by numbers. But even as she studies under the dim light of her desk lamp, something else is awakening, a question she's not yet ready to answer. If I'm not what I achieve, then who am I? There comes a moment in every life when the noise fades, the friends go home, the grades are posted, and she's left alone with her own reflection. The mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't answer either. It only stares back, asking the question she's avoided for years. Who are you? When no one is watching, for most teenage girls, identity is not discovered. It's constructed, piece by piece, shaped by influence, feedback, comparison. Every like, every opinion, every expectation becomes a thread woven into the fragile fabric of self. But when too many hands touch that fabric, the seams begin to pull. And what was once a clear picture becomes a collage, a mixture of other people's definitions, stitched together with her silence. It's here that the identity crisis begins. It's not chaos, it's awakening. The painful realization that she doesn't really know who she is outside of what others have told her to be. Ask yourself, when did we start believing that identity is supposed to be clear at 16? That at an age where emotions still outrun reason, where hormones surge and shift like tides, a young girl should somehow have a steady sense of self. We forget that adolescence is not about certainty, it's about exploration. It's the psychological bridge between imitation and individuality. And yet, instead of letting them cross that bridge, we fill it with rules, comparisons, and labels. The world tells her who to be. Be confident, but not too loud. Be kind, but not weak. Be ambitious, but still humble. Be natural, but make sure you're flawless. Every commandment contradicts the last, and each contradiction tears at her sense of direction. How can she find herself when every path leads to someone else's approval? The human brain, during adolescence, is deeply sensitive to social feedback. Each compliment triggers dopamine, a spark of validation. Each criticism floods the system with cortisol, the sting of rejection. Over time, this biochemical push and pull starts teaching her what version of herself gets rewarded. She learns which smiles earn approval, which silences prevent conflict, which masks keep her safe, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she trades authenticity for adaptation. But here's the paradox: the more she adapts, the emptier she feels. Because identity built on imitation cannot sustain the weight of existence. She can please everyone around her and still feel like a stranger in her own life. You can see it in her eyes, the quiet confusion. One moment she's confident, the next she's withdrawn. One day she feels powerful, the next invisible. That's not inconsistency. That's the mind trying to reconcile a self that's been divided too long. Psychologist Erik Erikson called this stage identity versus role confusion. It's the stage where adolescents ask, who am I and where do I belong? But what Erikson couldn't account for is how much faster the question multiplies in the modern age, an era where selfhood is curated online as much as it is developed within. Now, she doesn't just compare herself to classmates. She compares herself to millions of strangers she'll never meet. Every image, every profile, every perfect highlight reel becomes another reminder that she's falling short of an illusion. And so begins a kind of quiet fragmentation. One self for family, one self for friends, one self for social media, and one that exists only in private. Tired, uncertain, honest. She switches between them effortlessly, but the transitions take a toll, because the mind can only juggle so many versions of me before it forgets which one is real. When identity becomes performance, truth becomes something to hide. She might laugh louder than she feels. She might post photos captioned, "Living my best life," while secretly feeling like she's fading. But can you blame her? She's grown up in a world that rewards presentation more than presence. A world that praises how she looks but rarely asks how she is. This confusion, this identity crisis, isn't failure, it's evolution. It's her psyche saying, the versions you've built no longer fit the person you're becoming. It's the breaking of an old shell. Painful, yes, but necessary. Because without the breaking, there is no emergence. In psychology, there's a term, individuation. It's the process of becoming one's own person, separate from the roles and masks learned in childhood. It's messy, it's uncertain. It often feels like loss, because in a way, it is. To become herself, she must let go of who she was told to be, and loss, even loss of an old identity, always brings grief. Have you ever noticed how adolescence feels like mourning? She's mourning the simplicity of childhood, when identity wasn't questioned, only lived. She's mourning the loss of approval that comes when she finally says no. She's mourning the parts of herself that will never fit the mold again. Grief doesn't only come from death, it comes from becoming. And in growing up, she must bury the person she pretended to be to make space for the one she's meant to become. But within this crisis lies something sacred, self-awareness. When she starts to ask the hard questions, why do I do what I do? Who am I doing it for? What do I actually want? That's not confusion, that's awakening. It's the beginning of her inner life, a consciousness that's no longer defined by reflection, but by recognition of her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own truth. And truth, once found, can't be easily forgotten, even if she stumbles, even if she doubts. There's now a quiet voice inside her that says, you are not what they told you to be. That voice becomes her compass, her rebellination. The identity crisis is not a collapse, it's a creation. It's the messy middle between who she was and who she's becoming. And yes, it hurts. But the pain is not punishment, it's process. Growth doesn't whisper comfort, it whispers honesty. And honesty, though painful, is the first form of freedom. In time, she'll realize that identity is not something you find. It's something you build, over and over, through every mistake, every heartbreak, every act of courage. And she'll learn that she doesn't need to be consistent to be real. She only needs to be present. Maybe that's what growing up truly means. Not finding the perfect version of yourself, but finally accepting the imperfect one that's been there all along. So, as we move deeper into this journey, remember, behind every confident smile is someone still piecing together who they are. Behind every laugh, a question unspoken. And behind every mask, a truth waiting patiently to be known. This is the heart of becoming, and it's only just beginning. There's a moment in every young life when the theory of identity meets the test of experience, when reflection turns into action, when all the silent rehearsals inside the mind must face the eyes of others. For her, it begins with a tryout. A simple thing on the surface, a performance, a chance, a possibility. But beneath it lies something far greater, the need to prove that she belongs, not just in a group, but in herself. She stands there, waiting for her name to be called. Her hands tremble, not because she's afraid of movement, but because she's afraid of judgment. She feels every heartbeat like a drum in her chest. Every whisper around her sounds louder than it is. Every laugh, even innocent, feels like it could be about her. Have you ever stood in front of others and felt your soul shrink just a little? That sensation when the world feels like a mirror turned against you, reflecting not who you are, but who you fear they see. That's not weakness. That's vulnerability, the most human part of being alive. Psychologists call this moment self-efficacy, our belief in our ability to succeed in a given task. And for teenagers, it becomes the invisible engine behind confidence. But self-efficacy isn't built in silence. It's forged in risk, in trying something new, in stepping forward, even when failure feels inevitable. So she does. She steps out onto that gym floor, the sound of sneakers squeaking against polished wood, echoing like a heartbeat. The lights feel too bright. The room feels too big, but she breathes, and she begins. Her movements aren't perfect. Her rhythm falters. Her timing slips. But there's something more important happening. She doesn't stop. And that, right there, is courage in motion. Because courage isn't about doing it flawlessly. It's about doing it anyway. Every stumble, every imperfect gesture. It all becomes part of the story she's writing about herself. A story that says, I am allowed to try. I am allowed to fail. I am allowed to be human around her. Others perform, louder, sharper, more synchronized. She watches, not with jealousy, but with quiet reflection. For the first time, she realizes that success isn't measured by applause. It's measured by peace. The peace that comes from knowing you showed up, even when your voice trembled, even when your hand shook, even when doubt whispered louder than hope. What happens in this moment isn't about cheerleading at all. It's about identity and practice. It's about the psychology of effort, resilience, and belonging. She doesn't know it yet, but she's redefining her relationship with failure. Because failure isn't rejection, it's data, it's feedback, it's how the brain learns confidence. Self-efficacy grows not from getting everything right, but from realizing you can survive what goes wrong. And that's the paradox of adolescence. It's filled with moments that feel like endings, when in truth, they're beginnings disguised as disappointment. When the results are posted, her name isn't on the list. The room hums with excitement around her. But for her, there's silence. And yet, it's not defeat that fills her chest. It's something else, something quiet, something like acceptance. She smiles, small, but real, because for the first time she knows that she doesn't need validation to feel valid. And that is the moment when growth begins. Psychologists call this intrinsic motivation, the shift from doing things for approval to doing them for meaning. She may not have made the team, But she made contact with something far deeper, herself. In this single experience, she's learning what many adults never do. That failure, when faced with grace, becomes transformation. She's beginning to understand that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs in relief after trying. And when she walks away from that gym, she isn't walking away defeated. She's walking away defined, because identity isn't built from success. It's built from how we rise after falling, how we redefine worth when the applause fades, how we find dignity in imperfection. This is the quiet power of failure. The kind that doesn't humiliate but humanizes. The kind that strips away illusion and reveals character. Later, when she looks back, she won't remember the missteps or the stumble. She'll remember that moment before stepping forward, when fear said, "Don't," and courage whispered, "Go anyway." That's the moment that changes everything. And so we see it again, how the smallest experiences shape the deepest truths. How one act of courage in a school gym becomes the blueprint for every risk she'll take thereafter. The world will see a tryout, but psychology will see transformation. A young mind learning that failure doesn't end a story, it begins a better one. So she doesn't make the team, but she makes something far more important. A connection with herself that no applause could ever replace. And maybe that's the real victory. We often talk about resilience as if it's a victory, as if survival alone means we've healed. But the truth, resilience is quieter, more complicated. It's the art of walking forward with the limp that life left you. The teenage girl who once broke under pressure still feels it sometimes. She still questions herself, still wonders if she's enough, still carries invisible bruises from words that cut too deep and moments that made her doubt her worth. She's stronger now, yes, but strength didn't erase the pain. It just taught her how to carry it differently. We mistake resilience for invulnerability. But true resilience isn't about being untouched. It's about being changed and finding a way to live with that change. She's not the same girl she was before the heartbreak, before the expectations, before the pressure. She's stitched together with moments of fear and defiance, woven with memories she'll never say out loud. And yet, somehow, she still smiles. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Psychologically, this is called post-traumatic growth. The paradox where pain doesn't just destroy, it reshapes. The mind, when wounded, begins to reorganize itself. Neurons rewire, values shift, priorities change. You stop chasing what once mattered and start clinging to what actually does. But this transformation doesn't come wrapped in peace. It comes in waves of confusion, anger, exhaustion, and moments of fragile hope. Resilience, in reality, is not a clean upward climb. It's the act of falling over and over and still finding a reason to stand. And this is what society so often misses. We love the idea of a comeback, but not the cost. We admire the survivors, but rarely ask what survival took from them. We want the neat endings, not the raw middles that keep bleeding beneath the surface. But the truth is, healing isn't always visible. Sometimes it looks like showing up to another day, even when your soul feels heavier than your body. When we see these girls, laughing again, studying again, chasing dreams again, we think they've moved on. But inside, the echoes remain. The pressure, the self-doubt, the deep-rooted question, am I still enough? And yet she moves forward anyway. That's not denial. That's bravery. Psychologically, she's entering what's known as integration, where the mind learns not to erase pain, but to give it meaning. She starts to realize that every scar is a sentence in the story of who she's becoming. And while she may not understand the full story yet, she's learning that growth isn't about removing the cracks. It's about letting light through them. She may not have the fairy tale ending. There's no triumphant victory, no perfect resolution, just quiet endurance. And in that endurance, a kind of beauty that doesn't need applause, because resilience isn't a destination. It's a daily decision, a whisper. I'm still here, and so she carries on, bruised but breathing, damaged but determined. Smiling not because everything's fine, but because she refuses to let the darkness define her. That's not weakness. That's humanity. Raw, flawed, and magnificent. We often think strength is about overcoming, but maybe it's really about understanding. Understanding that being scarred doesn't make you broken. It makes you real. And maybe the most honest kind of healing is learning to live fully, even when some parts of you still ache. So to every teenage girl, and to the woman she will become, remember this: you are allowed to be both hurt and healing, both strong and uncertain, both scarred and beautiful. The goal isn't to escape the weight you carry. It's to learn how to carry it with grace. Thanks for listening to the end. It shows your care and empathy towards humanity and the trials for each stage we go through.
If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something real, you're exactly where you need to be, here. We don't promise happy endings. We promise truth. We promise humanity. This is the burden of being, where we uncover the quiet battles, the invisible wounds, and the silent resilience that defines us all. If you believe these stories matter, join us, like, share, and subscribe. Not just for content, but for connection. Because somewhere out there, someone is carrying a weight they can't name. And maybe, through stories like this, we can help them feel a little less alone.